from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
For the next 2 weeks, our subject is human values. We're going to approach this from a most historical perspective. We're very pleased to have a guest who has written a book that was recently published that traces the history of values throughout the human race, throughout time. It's very fascinating to watch that development. And of course, as you all know, it is very, very important in human behavior how those values have been developed and how they vary from culture to culture. Welcome to the program Dr. Rodney Fry, who holds a PhD in the field of anthropology. His degree was awarded by the University of Colorado. Presently, Dr. Fry is the director of the Coeur d'Alene campus of Lewis Clark State College, and we worked with him on a number of occasions, and we congratulate you, Rodney, on your recent book, and I would show this book to our viewers. It's called I Juggling. It has a subtopic called Seeing the World Through a Looking Glass and a Glass Pane, and I know one of the things that we're going to talk about is how you came up with that particular title, but we are grateful you're here, and it's a terribly exciting topic, and both this week and next week we shall, with our panel, pursue human values. Thank you very much for being here.
Pleasure being here.
And as always, I'm pleased to have regular panelists, Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and she is the law clerk to the North Idaho District Judge Gary Heyman. And next to her is a visiting panel member who's been with us before, Mr. Lloyd Marsh, who's on the faculty at North Idaho College teaching in the field of natural sciences. And Lloyd, as it has been in the past, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tony.
It's a pleasure to have you here. I shall ask Janelle Burke to commence the questioning.
Well, Dr. Fry, it's a pleasure to have you here, and we're going to talk a little bit about your book, I Juggling. What was the concept? How did you decide to develop the book? And then it's really a two-pronged question. Secondly, what does I Juggling mean?
Where did the book come from?
Yes, that's the first question.
It grew out of a course that had been taught for a number of years through Lewis Clark State College, focusing on values clarification, the interpretation of values, specifically those values relating to how people relate to the world around them, issues of wilderness, issues of nature. How do we define ourselves? And it was a course that was approached with a multidisciplined focus. That is, people from literature, natural science, and the social sciences would team teach this course. Over the years, having taught it now for 8 years, actually 2-3 times a year for 8 years, looking for a textbook that would address some of these issues, I didn't find anything that seemed quite suitable. And so, working with the students and working with my colleagues, we came up with a workbook, several articles put together one semester that the next semester expanded, and was refined, and each semester, with the input of the students and the input of the other faculty, we decided we had a workbook here that could be published and might have some value to other people. So it really evolved out of working with the students and other faculty in this particular course. But it marks out an area, it marks out a territory that I don't find a lot of other books addressing right now, specifically values, clarification, interpretation, dealing with the issues of how we relate to the land.
So along that same line, I'd like to say that although this book might have been developed for a course, it is very enjoyable reading, and some of our viewers may want to just read it because it is very enjoyable reading.
Exactly.
Now, tell us, what does I Juggling mean? And that's what will get them interested in reading.
I've always been impressed with the notion that we are the stories we tell. It's an important idea that comes out of many, many cultures. And there's one particular story that has always struck me as quite revealing of an attempt to see from various perspectives. And it's a Cheyenne Indian story of Coyote going about. In his trying to gain for himself, he's deceived, and he loses his eyes. And he picks up some other eyes. In the process, he sees from various perspectives. There's a lesson to be learned. Anyway, it is that story that became, I thought, a perfect metaphor for the entire activity of interpreting values from various perspectives.
Lloyd Marsh.
Well, I guess because of my scientific background, I always want to know from whence we come and how do we get where we are. And if we're looking at cultural evolution, the evolution of values as a human race, can you give us a little background? Is it a linear thing? I mean, did we start with nothing and evolve into what we are today linearly?
The workbook attempts to lay out a number of different story texts that spanned much of human history. The beginnings as understood in Christianity, the beginnings as understood by the Inuit, Eskimo, by the Australian Aborigine, by the scientists, a number of different approaches, and then moving through time, not necessarily linearly, but taking segments, taking chapters out of our humanity through time, and really trying to wrestle with some of the foundations upon which we today are based. I don't know if the values have changed. I would suggest that maybe they didn't change so much, but many of the foundations of who we are today, in fact, are cemented in distant past and recent past, but they are not so changing after all. So I wouldn't see the values themselves changing over time, but in fact much of the cultural context in which they're housed as changing, but the values upon which that context is placed is very much
well, just
the same.
Maybe a follow-up to that. We look at for example, the beginnings of civilization and human beings as isolated individuals, and then I would think, and I'm not an anthropologist, so I don't know all the answers, but evolving into tribal societies and so forth. Did the scope of values change? Did it widen as a result of this clannish behavior that we followed?
Well, I'm not sure there was a change, a progression. Actually, the concept of individual, I think in our history, is a very recent concept, and that's very critical to who we are today in Western society and European society, American society, but something relatively very unique. And it was a collectivity that I think for a long time has defined who we are, and that has a lot of history.
I'm always trying to look at it from the perspective of a viewer sitting at home. I try to ask the question they might be thinking about, and I sense that some of our viewers are saying, well, let's define what values are. We're suggesting that they've always been around and that they may not change in their identity, but cultures may reorganize those. So I guess I would have the classroom question for you of what do we mean by the term values?
Well, there's certainly many definitions, and this is not exclusive of other definitions, to be sure. But we've tried to give students in this book an opportunity to latch on to something that is very critical, that is very inclusive of both individual values and values that you might find expressed in a community, in an area itself. So it's inclusive of that. Values we would maintain are something that is learned. It's not something we're born with. Values help decide right and wrong. They help lay out the territory in our making decisions. They're very emotionally charged. We feel passionately about our values. And in turn, the values set the stage for our behavior. I would say they don't determine our behavior, but they set the stage for it. There's a lot of influences deciding what we do, a lot of influences contributing to our decision-making. Values, I think, are paramount among those, but not the only influence on what we do. And so we're not saying that values are a direct corollary to our behavior, but they're a major influence on our behavior. Again, in our book, we've tried to lay out a methodology for students to really explore values. And with this very generic, very open-ended definition of values, they should be able to apply it to all sorts of situations effectively.
In your book, when you talk about I Juggling, you indicate that values are defined as learned and relatively enduring, as you've already indicated. I was impressed by my researcher who was reading the book and giving me some information for you. He indicated that you, in the book, were suggesting that values as they are learned and are enduring come from 3 different processes. Would you identify those for us, please?
Well, where they come from is quite open-ended and multifaceted. They come from our experiences as a young child. There's certainly influence as a child through our education processes, of more formal education processes. Our values are influenced by our leisure time, our recreation time, by our family structures, by our kinship structures. Those are among the influences. Values, as you suggested in the definition, are relatively enduring. In that regard, there's something that we seldom talk about. It's like the nearest analogy is that of our linguistic grammar. We have a very difficult time articulating. I think if we sat down and talked about what is our grammar, how is it structured, but nevertheless, because it's so basic to our speech and interpreting other people's speech, we take it for granted. And values are very much the same way. They're deeply seated, not simply helping influence our language and interpret other people's language, but interpret our behavior as well as other people's behavior.
But once those are introduced, obviously a baby is not born with a language, etc., with opinions and attitudes. But as you are developing, even as an adult, in process, and you talk about values in relation to coming from senses and a term you call mental conceptualization and intuition. Would you explain that to us?
The values themselves are certainly influenced by our physical circumstances,
okay.
By the apparatus we have. And there is certainly a lot of research suggesting that it's who we are, in fact, is in part influenced by our genetics. I mean, some of the work of Chomsky with language and Piaget and child rearing suggests that there are some physiological stages that all of humanity goes through. So we don't want to get into this issue of nature, nurture, and simply say this is all nature and nothing nurture. It's all cultural and not biological. There are biological factors at work here, and to a certain extent, how we physically interact with our environment, our senses, will also influence our values. But we're isolating values as something as part of something very much learned, but very deep-seated in our behavior.
Janelle Berg.
I want to explore a little bit the progress of mankind and what is progress. You, in your book, contrast gatherers and hunters with our society today. And can you point out to some of the people, I thought it was very interesting, some of the things that we consider are sort of myths, really, actually. We believe they're facts.
Right. In this workbook, we try to give students a tool for interpreting values. And I've laid out in the book 10 different, what I call story texts. And these are little vignettes. They're vignettes that are reflective of different aspects of our humanity, going from very early times to domestication of plants and animals, throughout Western history, some major chapters in our Western history, but also looking at other cultures. Always an attempt to help students clarify our values as a human species relative to the world around us. And I think by juxtaposing often very distant, culturally distant, or historically distant stories along with what is very, very contemporary and very close, that in doing that we can better explore many of our own assumptions. And one of those major assumptions is looking at how gather-hunter peoples of the past and contemporary have lived relative to the world around them. And we have, I think, a common understanding that their way of life for most of our history has been one of savagery, of just living on the margins of existence, and fighting for that sort of survival of the fittest situation. And I think that through a reinterpretation of that, a re-understanding of that, we find that gather-hunter way of life is, in fact, I had a tremendous amount of leisure time. The average age for many gather-hunter peoples was at 60, 65 years of age. There were few diseases in many gather-hunters. Again, acknowledging the variation of that society. Again, in looking at reinterpreting our history, we then have to ask the question, why do we so often look at history as progress, as moving toward a better state, when in fact we have to look at it for what it is, each individual segment of it standing on its own merits. And then when you start asking those sorts of questions, you're asking about your own values. And in Western society, the idea of improvement, of progress, of moving toward a utopian state is an important value that we most of us share. But it's important that we come to understand that. It's a value that other peoples may not share. So it's all an attempt to searching out our values.
In the book, you kind of also indicate that hunter-gatherers may have been as large as we are today, and then people may have become less large as they began to become more dependent on food gathering in a specific spot. And of course, you work in the walls of Jericho, the self-contained community. Do you want to explore all those ideas a little bit?
A
That's
lot of
long
ideas.
way.
A lot of
Here in a
ideas.
short time.
Well, very quickly, when we as a human species, as a Homo sapiens species, again, looking at the values from the science of one of the values we look at in here, the scientific perspective, and looking at those values, we see that the records suggest that at our early stages of gather-hunters, before domestication of plants and animals, before 10,000 years ago, that the human species was physiologically relatively tall and robust and living a fairly healthy lifestyle. We introduced the story dealing with Jericho, not the Jericho of biblical understanding, but the Jericho of archaeological, one of the early sites of plant domestication. And we find there, for many, many generations after that, the well-being of those who relied upon agriculture actually disintegrated. And physiologically, we reduced in size, our age was reduced, all sorts of diseases started creeping in. The question then is asked, why did we domesticate? And in our society, we place tremendous importance on domestication of plants and animals as a sort of a marker of civilization, when in fact the actual causes may have suggested it was simply accidental and a last resort for certain groups to even exist. And it was certainly not the preferred way of moving for gather-hunters. But as a result of an accident and not a preferred route, eventually we produce, we domesticate, through domestication, produce a very productive item, the plants and animals that can give civilizations tremendous nourishment.
Lloyd Marsh.
I want to explore this a little more. We talk about culturally distant civilizations or groups, and yet we can refer back to the commonality of biological influences. Do you find some of the commonality in the cultural values accidental, or as a result of this common thread of biological influences or environmental influences?
Yeah. I don't have the answer there. This workbook attempts to set the stage for the student, for him or herself, to come up with some of those answers. And I'm simply laying out much of the territory there. I would be reluctant to suggest some of those factors at this point.
Okay. The scientific values, they really sort of get me excited, because that's part of what I do. I teach science. And looking back, we really see the evolution of the scientific community as we know it sometime after the Renaissance. But do you have stories that reflect on science before the age of the Renaissance and modern science? Are there science influences in our values further back?
Well, I would think so. I think we can see science at Jericho 10,000 years ago in a selection of plants. I think we can see science in Pythagoras and looking at the world of sound and space and seeing organizational principles there that can be quantified. I think that we can see some definite science prior to the Renaissance. I think the attempt to quantify, to physically to understand the physical operations of the world has been part of humanity for a long time. And it certainly took a shot in the arm with the Renaissance, but I think we can see the antecedents a long time ago.
Dr. Fry, you were very nice to bring along some sketches and graphs and so forth, or diagrams, I should say, to help us understand this evolution as to values or their development. I wish you'd kind of set the stage for us. In a moment, we're going to put on the screen the first drawing that you have with us. Explain to us what your intent and purpose was in doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, again, Tony, we're trying to present a number of story texts. One of the first ones is called The Dream Animal, and it deals with one of the early stories of our humanity, one of the stories of our early humanity. And in that particular story text, we're looking at some artwork from the Upper Paleolithic, from Spain and from France. And again, it's an attempt at, when you see a piece of artwork that was done in the caves in the Pyrenees 10,000 15, 20,000 years ago, what was the intent of the artist? Trying to understand their definition of, in this case, the animal here that we're seeing that would be painted on the wall, and maybe the hunter. And how is the person defining its relationship with the animal? What is it that defines a human being? And so again, asking those sorts of questions. How has humanity defined its relationship with the world around it? And again, this is a story text, not unlike any story text that we might be confronted with.
And when you do that, you're also really talking about how, again, the values in early period fit in relation to what they are today.
Mm-hmm.
Would you take us a little further and bring us past that period and some of the things that are happening? And again, we're going to, in a moment, going to show another graph that relates to that. If you would introduce this for us.
Well, one of the other story texts looks again at some of the foundations of our scientific. This is Ptolemy's conceptualization of the universe, and it was beautifully laid out in circles, perfect spheres. And it interestingly enough, placed the earth in the center along with divinity. And of course, for later science would look at this model and say how physically ridiculous it is. It doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't account for our physical understanding of the world. But then we have to ask the question, what did this model do for peoples of the Middle Ages and early Renaissance? And we're looking at this model, we're seeing that it's not simply a physiological definition of how humanity is relating to the larger world, but actually also a spiritual understanding and an artistic understanding and defining their relationship with the world. That is, God is very much part of their lives and not separate from, as it perhaps would become after Galileo and Newton.
But are you suggesting from that again, there has been a development in that process?
I'm not saying a development. I'm going to shy away from that tremendously in this interview, that there has been an evolution or a development of values. I'm saying that there's going to be a switching and oscillating from one set of values to another, and maybe we can clarify that. This particular sketch is another one of the sketches that appears in one of the stories dealing with the Crow Indians in Montana and a vision quest. Much of the story text, a couple of the story texts deals with how we understand knowledge, how knowledge is acquired. And again, looking at how knowledge is acquired and defined influences how we relate to the world. And when you contrast an individual who learns about the world through a vision quest, and in part of the vision quest puts together this rock formation, this is a rock formation that can be found in the Bighorn Mountains called a medicine wheel. When you contrast understanding the world as a great wagon wheel, a great circular formation like this, and gaining knowledge of the world through a vision quest, and contrast that with how John Locke or René Descartes approach understanding the world and acquiring knowledge, again, it's very revealing. And that's what we try to do in a couple of the story texts there.
Janelle Burke.
Well, we've gone from these wonderful ideas, but I want to be practical too for our viewers. And one of the things that we can do as individuals to perpetuate our culture and to deal with our values is to take interviews and to listen to stories of other people. How do you suggest that we do this? If we have people in our own families that are interesting and we want to perpetuate our family values, how can we do that?
In the book here, we've tried to, it is for all of people, it's for a large audience, not simply a college classroom. Part of the early sections of the book deal with a methodology we call I Juggling. It talks about interpreting values, and it talks about interviewing. If we go back to the basic premise that we are the story we tell, all of us have wonderful stories, and within those stories are important values that help define each of us as individuals, help define us within a family, within a community. One way that we're suggesting then to help understand each other and to perpetuate our own values is for each of us to have greater skills at interviewing each other, of revealing each other's stories. In the class that we use this textbook for example, we have the students go out and interview someone, gathering their life history, a stranger, a neighbor, a work individual that they work with, and the result is fantastic. It's really the true essence of I Juggling. We do it all the time. We're constantly trying to understand each other. But if we have a little bit better systematic methodology, we can in fact apply interpreting and in interviewing to other peoples to explore their stories. So important to families. It's been wonderful having these sort of life histories come out of the class and give them as wonderful gifts back to the people interviewed, to have this important record of who this individual is, their history, then as part of that family's history, so that their children and grandchildren can read this and better understand who they are and who their family is. But to actually do the interpretive work, to actually do the interviewing is quite common sense. We lay out a few very basic, how to use open-ended questions and how to use them tape recorder properly, to how to build rapport with individuals so they feel comfortable, so they can be very honest and sincere in their responses to your questions. It's something we always do, and we just have to be reminded and brush up our methodology of how to listen to someone else share their story.
Lloyd Marsh.
Can we pursue this just a little further? The stories, do we start off when you're interviewing the people, are they little vignettes or little small instances in a person's life, or do they start from the first memorable events in one's life to present day? How do they do that?
It partly depends upon what your intent is.
Yeah.
And our intent here in this workbook is to try to get a sense of their entire life history. And it's a very ambitious process, but chronologically is the structure, so you can start very early and start pulling out those memories, and those memories that generate further memories once they're spoken aloud in the interview, and bringing forth that wonderful story that begins to flow and to start clicking in the mind of the person being interviewed, and just chronologically. And you can be able to start pulling out patterns in the person telling the story. I mean, we don't sit around talking about our lives very often in our early remembrances, but once you begin that process through the interviewing from a student or someone else, this wonderful flowering of a story ushers forth and becomes a gem. But it does have a natural structure all of its own once it's allowed to come forth.
May I interrupt
Absolutely.
just a second to say, many of us are products of what has been happening around us, and I would think that there would be many people that could interview family members who had come through the Great Depression, and who would be willing to say this was something that set my values forever as a result of what was happening to my family, my parents, etc.
On that note, we had to bring the program to conclusion, and I know that Janelle and Lloyd both have other questions they want to ask as well as myself. And for those viewers who've got very involved with this interview, the good news is that you'll be back again next week for part 2, and we will continue this discussion and also look at some of the case studies from throughout history where you have identified how they use their values in their life. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this program, and I invite you to be with us again next week at the same time, and we will continue this subject. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station. From the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist, Tony Stewart.
I welcome you back to our second and final week with our guest, Dr. Rodney Fry. And for our viewers who were not with us last week, we had a very stimulating conversation about the historical understanding of human values from the very early history of humankind until the present time. Our guest is highly qualified to continue this discussion this week, and I think you will find it most interesting as every human being addresses their values and how that may determine certain parts of their life. Our guest has written a book addressing this subject, and it is entitled I Juggling, Seeing the World Through a Looking Glass and a Glass Pane. Dr. Rodney Fry has a PhD in the field of anthropology that was received at the University of Colorado. He is now the director of the Coeur d'Alene, Idaho campus of Lewis Clark State College. Dr. Fry, we had a very exciting time last week, and as we said at the end of the program after we went off the air, we just got started, and so let's continue that pursuit today.
Wonderful.
Welcome back. I'm very pleased to have regular panelist Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Lloyd Marsh, who is a visiting panel member and does this from time to time. We're delighted to have him, and he is a member of the faculty at North Idaho College teaching in the natural sciences. We shall ask Janelle to commence the questioning.
Dr. Fry, it's a pleasure to have you here and be talking with you again about this interesting subject. Each day we make lots of value judgments. No matter what our profession or our job or our life might be like, we have to each day decide many times over, and one of the factors that we use in determining things is what are our values. How can your book help us when we're making decisions on a daily basis?
Yeah.
How can your book be of help?
Well, I think you're so right in that in all of our endeavors, regardless of our field of operation, whether we're working in the health-related fields, it's in a legal field, law enforcement, in the business world, we're constantly working with others who may have similar values or whose values may be very different than our own. And particularly in this world that's becoming rapidly very internationalized, differing values are an important aspect of our working with other people. And so it becomes very critical, it seems to me, that we have a methodology, a tool at our disposal to allow us to better communicate with each other, and through that communication ultimately work together in a cooperative endeavor. If you're negotiating a business operation, if you're working with, if you're in the business world and trying to complete a negotiation, if you're in the healthcare situation and working with a patient, if you're in law enforcement working with a person from a different cultural setting, to understand their values, to understand their motivations is critical to better be able to communicate and work cooperative with them.
Now, it's my understanding that in your book you're not trying to tell people how to reach their values or what values to have, but you're better trying to help them understand how values are formed.
We're not trying to legislate that this is the proper values you should have. These are good values and these are improper values. Nothing like that. Simply trying to give the reader a tool for interpreting values. And if you have solid methodology, if you have a solid tool to interpret other people's values and get a better handle on your own values, that's all we're asking here.
And along that same line, you're not saying that values evolve. They don't become better over time. It's my understanding in your book, but you're saying that this is how values are formed.
Some people's values would suggest they do become better over time, and that's to be appreciated and understood. But we're not trying to suggest that in this book.
Or that values have evolved over history necessarily, that there's an evolution of values.
We're not proposing that at all. These are some basic values that I think have been with humanity since the dawn of humanity, and they've manifested themselves in different ways throughout the history, but not suggesting that there's been a progression of improvement of necessary values. Now, we've refined how we understand ourselves. We've certainly improved our human situation considerably. We have a better understanding of ourselves, maybe spiritually, physically, the medical world, the scientific world. There has been progress there. I'm not suggesting that, but the basic values underlying those progressions are consistent over time.
And in your book, you point out that values or kinds of values have always been with us. They're present in stories, they're present in poems, they're present in artwork in a variety of forms. Is that correct?
I think as we walk through any spectrum of our life and daily life, we're bombarded by values. They are in architecture, the structuring of our clothing, the styles of our clothing, the food we eat. There's certain assumptions underlying all of human activity that are value-laden, that help dictate our world around us.
Lloyd Marsh.
In the structure of the book, you've used the technique of looking at stories about people's lives, and you suggested last week that in interviewing we learn a lot about people's values. Can you share a couple of the stories and how we might look at those stories to interpret values of that particular aspect?
I've just opened to one of the stories called Soul Food. And this is a particular story text that comes from the Eskimo people, the Inuit people, one of their creation stories. And we've tried to present the story text itself in the book in an oral tradition format. Again, this is a people who did not have writing, and so when the students access this particular story text, for instance, they're asked to listen to someone else read it to them. And so they're creating a context to better appreciate the story as it would be traditionally conveyed. And the story goes on about their creation and the presence of this woman and some deception. There's a tremendous adventure that transpires in this story, but it eventually results in bringing forth of the animals and the birds and populating the world with human beings. But there's some assumptions, some values underlying this particular story that contrast it with the story that immediately precedes it, dealing with the tower, the story of agriculture, and how people have related to the world of plants and animals being domesticated. And so it's the contrast there between those two different types of story texts that allow the reader to better appreciate the importance of how they relate to the animal world, for example, in two very different ways.
So after we've read the story or had the story read to us, whatever the case may be, then does the class structure a way of investigating those stories to uncover the values that are
Exactly.
addressed?
An individual reader can take the workbook and having read them, the stories, or having heard them as their son or daughter or spouse reads them to them, they apply then the methodology of I Juggling, of interpreting to the exploration of the story text, trying to pull out the key sentences, the key symbols within the story that suggest very important values that are underlying it. Again, it's a technique then, as you suggested, for really diving into after the fact to help better understand that. And again, this is simply an exercise that you would do, but in our conversations, as we talked about last week in the interviewing of someone else, there we have presented another story, and then it's pulling out the key sentences, the phrases that are really that hint to the underlying values that helped influence that person's life.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I can't resist the temptation to do a little dialogue and cross-examination approach. But before I do that, Dr. Fry is such a great friend. He is always so agreeable. I have looked at a lot of sociologists and psychologists and others' discussion of values, and there's some really interesting debates going on about identifying the number of values. A really well-known person, Dr. Laswell, has written a lot in this field, and he suggested that we might take all the world's values and place them in 8 values with very broad terms that would fit every particular category. And then Dr. Rokeach, who was a well-known psychologist at Washington State University, played around with this idea and I believe looked at 240 or 250 values and then combined those into categories and groups to where he came up with 36 values, 18 intrinsic and 18 extrinsic values. Have you played this game, or have you tried to say that all societies have the same values and we can identify the names of each of those values?
Oh, you are trying to corner me, Tony.
I guess my first question is actually in the category the second question is going to be.
Yeah. Well, let me just reiterate that it is the intent of the book not to do that, is not to render this so academic that we become exclusive of the possibility of other people's values. I simply want the reader or the student who takes this book into their hands to have a tool for better understanding values. If they have the methodology down, they'll have a technique to allow them to better interpret other people's values and to have closure, have some sort of closure on their own values. Having stated that, at the end of the book, I do offer my own interpretation that I maintain is simply one of many interpretations. And as we've ambitiously set out in this book to try to outline a lot of the foundations of all of humanity and how we as a people have related to the world around us, how we've related to land, to the animals, to the plants around us, I do offer my own interpretation. And that refers then to the subtitle of the book, looking at the world through a looking glass and a glass pane. And in my own interpretation, I've suggested there's 2 major paradigms of values, one called the looking glass and the other the glass pane. And within each of these are a set of 6 to 8 major, very inclusive value structures that have helped shape helped formed our humanity as we related through time. And it's not been a situation that we've progressed from one to the other. It's not that one set of values is better than another set of values. They're both equally important as a people. We depend upon them as a human species. We have throughout time. But we've emphasized at various times one set of values over another. And it's become that sort of oscillating movement from one to the other that we see differences through time and in cultures.
Because a lot of our viewers haven't had the privilege of seeing your book, give us a little more clear example of these two that you have identified as the glass pane and the looking glass.
Well, in the glass pane worldview, taking that as a metaphor of seeing the world through a glass pane, that is, the world out there is somehow separate from you, that it sort of runs on its own accords and has its own laws. Now, this sort of assumption is basic to much of Western philosophy and science. The scientific methodologies depend upon an objectified world that's separate from us, that we can observe independent of it.
But you're suggesting can influence?
And does not influence that world. That is an ideal is structured within the values. Now, the glass pane worldview sees the world as a great mirror. A looking glass. A looking glass is a great mirror, that when you look out into the world, you're seeing, in a certain sense, a reflection of who you are internally. And that there's a linkage, there's a continuity, there's a kinship, and the world isn't somehow autonomous and separate. Within the looking glass world, it's a world of quality, it's a world of aesthetic and spiritual qualities. In the glass pane worldview, this world of objectification, it's a world of looking at the physical qualities of the world, the material qualities of the world, and of quantifying those values. There's some basic different assumptions within both paradigms. Both are equally important, ultimately, I think, for the survival of the human species, but both have to be balanced, it seems to me.
And one final question before I go back to the panel, and it really zeroes in on this. On the first program, you indicated that values obviously are very important, but they do not totally determine the behavior of individuals. Let me give you an example and let you react to this. If I would be so risky as to suggest a value, among the many that I have seen listed, one would be power, another would be wealth, and others would be justice and freedom, equality, and so forth, by those who wish to identify them. If we take an individual and say that that individual through a process has taken on that power is the most important value, that it supersedes everything else. An individual that did that, I think, was Adolf Hitler, and therefore I would contend really controlled his behavior and what he did. So is it correct to assume that a particular individual may be somewhat even almost obsessed with a particular value, and that would dictate their behavior more than someone else who had a different perspective of values?
I'm going to have to back away from the response directly, in that power is, I'm not sure, is a value. I would want to explore that more fully with you, because you could have spiritual power, you could have artistic power. For the Australian Aborigines, they're very concerned about power. It's the power of the dream time. And there's almost an obsession about that. To be outside what they call the law, the dream time, is to lose any sense of meaning to one's life.
So the degrees are different kinds of power?
They're interested in power, but it's a very different sort of sense than the power of Hitler, that's concerned about power for one's own stake, that's concerned about a power that disenfranchises other people's for one's own agenda. It's a very different sort of power. So I would want to look more closely at the values. In the terminology of the book, we could see that power could be expressed in many different value formations. And if it's simply a power for economic or political purposes, that's one value. But there's a power in social justice that could dominate someone's life just with as much passion as it did with Hitler.
Sure. Janelle Burke.
Man has always had a curiosity about his beginning. And you have indicated that there are some common threads, perhaps, that run through creation stories, but there are also some differences. Can you tell us some stories from creation?
Well, it is fascinating when you start contrasting, comparing various creation accounts, and including creation accounts, the Genesis out of the Christian tradition, or the Australian Aborigine understandings of their own creation, or even contrasting that with the creation story as understood by natural science of evolution. There are certain parallels there. I would want to suggest that there's some real interesting parallels working that may be expressive of the workings of the human mind. But on the other hand, as a workbook for values clarification, I don't want us to simply become so concerned about the interpretation and the analysis of the stories that we lose the intent of the stories as championed by those telling the stories. So that for the Christian who has a firm belief in Genesis as the origin of the humans, we want to validate that as a very important truth for them, and in no way simply dismiss it by making this sort of comparative work and overanalyzing it and thus making it less valuable. And again, for the scientist, for the Austrian originally, these are truths. These are basic truths, and we want to respect each person's truths. And that's, in values clarification, it's not an attempt at so intellectually analyzing another story that we render them silly or without substance. These are truths. These are passions that people have, and we want to respect that throughout it. But there are a lot of parallels.
In each one of them, people are concerned about their relationship with nature. Is that correct?
Every creation story helps define a people in relation to the world around them in many different ways. The story of the natural scientist, it's a story of survival, of dealing with the physical circumstances of your world around you. There's a value then of progression, of improvement through time, of better adaptation. When you look at the story of the Inuit creation story, there it's talking about a harmonious relationship, not of a struggle at all, but of partnership and kinship with the world around you, not this struggle that you sometimes can interpret from the story of natural science. On the other hand, in the story of the Christian account, again, there's many different variations, interpretations here, but again, there's certain values that come out of that story that have helped define who we are. Again, these are stories of our past, but these are stories we carry into the present, and to the extent that they are still meaningful for us, they help influence and are a reflection of our values that we use to help influence and interpret our world all the time.
What is the place then of symbols in our lives?
Well, symbols, I think, are sort of the markers, are sort of the language of our values. They're the way in which we can approach our values. It's sort of the words of our values. The various symbols, whether they're expressed in our clothing, our food, our architectural styles, our behavior, those are all symbolic expressions that are revealing of our values, it seems to me.
Lloyd Marsh.
I'm concerned when now we've sort of separated different cultures and we've looked at different cultural values that may be present in any particular culture. What happens when a culture, you have multicultural mixing? For example, a black American. There are cultural values that we Americans probably have, but I'm sure vested in the black society are some black cultural values. Do these come in conflict sometimes?
Any one of us is an assemblage of a lot of different values, many of which have absolutely no, at least on the surface of the things, any relationship whatsoever. But we reconcile those, each of us, and we all come from different traditions that with them bring different values with them, and we put them together in all unique ways, individually or as communities, as social groups. And so I think it's a struggle that we all would want to acknowledge within ourselves. I think in the issue of different races, different ethnic groups coming together, that just adds to the whole issue of choice and of better improving who we are, the more variation. I think it's a truism of natural science, for example, that in any healthy ecosystem, diversity is a key to its survivability. And I think if that metaphor has value in a natural science sphere, in a cultural sphere, in a societal sphere, the health and well-being of society is a marker of its diversity as well. And the greater the diversity, that is diversity with tolerance and respect for each other, the healthier that community will also be. Now that's my values, and I would want to clarify that.
And I could absolutely agree with it. So I'm sort of curious, you mentioned that you team taught this course. What did the natural science person have to contribute to the course as you look at values?
Wonderfully. I mean, natural science is based upon a whole assemblage of very powerful values that influence all of our lives, about how we define ourselves as a human being and the natural world around us. There's insights that the natural science people can bring, and important insights. Likewise, when we can contrast that with a person coming out of literature that's dealing with the great written traditions of Western civilization, you contrast those two modes. Sometimes they're very, very different, but in the contrast there, both sets of values that emanate out of both individuals, both traditions, again, contribute to who we are, and by contrasting and comparing them, better understand who we are, because we are very influenced by natural science, it seems to me.
One of the things that runs through your book, too, I Juggling, and I should mention to our viewers that University Press of America published this book. There's a lot of discussion in your courses about that, but with a comparison of wilderness compared with domestication or domestic life, and how we have gone maybe from an early period of wilderness into a more domestic life. In that connection, is there any particular significance in how those two interrelate with the values, depending upon how you perceive both?
Yeah. Wilderness is one of those elusive terms that means so many different things to so many different people. So it becomes a wonderful tool to use in a book dealing with values clarification, because each of us in this studio and each of our listeners has their own definition of values, of wilderness. And again, that becomes a very useful tool here. We're making the point that throughout time, again, depending upon the particular values that you hold dear to yourself, you're going to find wilderness differently, very differently. And actually, the concept of wilderness probably does not have any validity until you have domestication of plants and animals. Peoples prior to domestication of plants and animals, did they live in a wilderness? How would they contrast wilderness with civilization? Wildness with something civilized. When they're a part of the natural world, it's only when you're removed from a natural setting and now the forces of wildness are a threat to the domesticated plant that the very concept of wilderness can even come into existence. And so then at that point we start seeing a different understanding of wilderness, and it has meant many, many different things throughout history and time.
And domestication, as it relates to wilderness, is not domestication versus wilderness, but there is some connectedness, and that they work in concert.
Well, I would think that domestication is the necessary ingredient to create the concept of wilderness, and with the concept of wilderness, the possibility of its existence. Again, the basic premise of the book is that we are the stories we tell. What we conceptualize symbolically in our culture is what we create in our world.
And for us, then, that is truth.
Exactly. What is wilderness? Where do we go to explore wilderness? In nature? No. We go into someone's story about wilderness to understand what wilderness is. It has definition and meaning to the extent that we have a concept of it. And so we explore values through people's stories of wilderness and other key symbolic expressions.
I can't resist one more question from that. Even within the United States, and certainly compared with other societies, there are some regions that are much more deeply involved in maybe a more organized way of storytelling, and so are they more deeply involved in trying to understand values?
I think we are just as involved in storytelling, but our stories are disseminated in very different ways than traditional storytellers.
Just different vehicles.
Certainly our neighbors here in our community, the Coeur d'Alenes, have a very traditional form of storytelling that through that form of narrative enshrines their basic values and is very important. Their sacred truths are in their stories, and their elders, they tell those stories. But I think that all of us are in a storytelling mode too. We've redefined the format of storytelling, and we might want to rethink that format too. For our young people, that format may be video games. It may be the movie theater. It may be the educational setting. It may be the car. A car, the movement of car on Sherman Avenue, our main street here, is a storytelling expression, you see. So storytelling comes in lots of different ways. The dissemination and sharing of stories comes to us in many different media and vehicles. And so I think that we're still involved with storytelling.
Some are just publicized in different ways.
Yes.
Janelle Burke.
Well, last time we talked a little bit about being practical and interviewing people. Let's talk a little bit about interpretation this time.
Right.
When we're interpreting someone else's values, what are the dangers? Should we always have respect for their value system?
It is a challenge, and it's not. We do it all the time. We're always kind of ad hocing our interpretation of other people as we constantly interact with them. We have to. But to do it with respect for someone else, the first step is to listen, to be in a listening mode, and not to simply, without thought on our own part, to impose our values on them. We all carry with us baggage, our own perspective, and to simply impose that onto someone else without thinking about what we're doing can prevent the entire process of interpretation of someone else. Listening, trying to really see ourselves in their shoes. Now, I need to mention that we can never ultimately know someone else. We can never ultimately see through someone else's eyes. It's a challenge that we can never succeed at doing. But that shouldn't prevent us from trying, to getting closer, to exploring their assumption, their values on themselves. It is a rigorous and difficult process without simply biasing it with our own stereotypes of standing back. But on the other hand, it's important to realize our own values, to know where we've been, because it allows us then, through our own personal experiences, to get closer. As long as we don't blind ourselves to someone else through our own values, but can use our own values, then we can get a little closer to someone else.
On that note, we must bring the program to conclusion. On behalf of the panel and our staff, Dr. Rodney Fry, thank you for this 2 weeks of stimulating discussion about human values and their historical perspective. Again, we appreciate your time.
Thank you, Tony.
Ladies and gentlemen, I know you've enjoyed this 2-week series. It's been stimulating for us and the learning process, and we invite you to be with us again next week at this same time when we will discuss what we believe to be yet another important topic. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.